Hey you. Yes, you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into tonight's true crime case. So, don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. It was the first day of March 2025, and the world seemed to continue on as it always had. Routines, schedules, meetings, and the subtle hum of the digital age in the background. Yet, for me, things were far from ordinary. I had just received a peculiar notification on my phone, a message from an unknown number, with a single sentence that would forever alter the course of my life. Maria Angeles Molina is not who you think she is. I'd never heard of Maria Angeles Molina before, but the message sent an inexplicable chill through my spine. What did it mean? And who could possibly send such a cryptic text? I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the screen, a knot forming in my stomach. The name Maria Angeles Molina meant nothing to me, yet it felt strangely familiar, like an echo from a forgotten dream. It took me several minutes to calm my racing thoughts before I decided to investigate further. The first step was obvious, a quick search online. Maria Angeles Molina was a relatively common name, but after sifting through dozens of irrelevant results, I stumbled upon a news article from the previous year, dated October 2024. The headline read, Maria Angeles Molina, identity theft victim or mastermind? The article, although brief, was enough to stir my curiosity further. It detailed the case of a woman who had reported having her identity stolen multiple times. She had become a victim of a shadowy criminal network that specialized in using stolen identities for various illicit activities. The story, however, wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. The article hinted at an underlying mystery. Questions about her role in the scheme, her connections, and her past were never fully addressed. I dug deeper into the details. The investigation had started in 2023 when Maria first reported her identity being stolen. The case was typical at first, involving false documents, fake credit cards, and a series of financial transactions under her name. But as the investigation progressed, a strange pattern emerged. The stolen identity wasn't just used for mundane purposes like buying goods or running up debt. There were darker elements at play. Someone somewhere was using her identity for far more nefarious schemes, and Maria seemed to be the central figure, whether she knew it or not. I read through the article, feeling an unsettling sense of unease. But I couldn't stop there. My mind, ever inquisitive, pushed me to uncover more about this enigma named Maria Angeles Molina. What was her real story? What had she become involved in? And most importantly, what did this strange message I'd received mean? Days passed, and I kept coming back to the case, unable to let it go. Each new detail uncovered only deepened the mystery. And as I dug deeper, I learned something else. Maria had disappeared. In December 2024, the trail went cold. No one knew where she had gone, and the authorities had no answers. She had simply vanished from the public eye, like a shadow in the night. In the following months, rumors began to swirl. Some suggested she had been involved in a more dangerous world than just stolen identities. Others believed she was the mastermind of a far-reaching conspiracy involving money laundering, cybercrimes, and even murder. I couldn't help but be drawn into these whispered theories, despite the lack of concrete evidence. By mid-March 2025, something unexpected happened. I was contacted again, this time by a journalist named Carla Sanchez, who had been investigating Maria's case for months. She had seen my inquiries online and, perhaps sensing a shared interest, reached out to me. Her message was simple yet cryptic. I think we're both looking for the same thing. Meet me at the usual place. The usual place was a small cafe on the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't draw attention. Its discreetness was perfect for anyone who wanted to keep things low-key. I showed up at the appointed time, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Carla was waiting for me when I arrived. She didn't look like someone who had spent months chasing leads on a case that seemed to be leading nowhere. She looked tired, worn down, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that matched mine. Over the next few hours, we exchanged information, piecing together a fragmented story of Maria Angeles Molina. We learned that Maria had been born into a family with connections to the underworld. Her father, once a well-known figure in the criminal circles of Spain, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances when Maria was only a child. This left her with a complicated legacy. The daughter of a notorious figure trying to carve out a normal life in a world that refused to forget her family's past. However, it wasn't until she turned 27 in 2024 that things started to take a dark turn. The first incident of identity theft was followed by another, and then another, each one more invasive than the last. Maria reported the incidents to the police, but she also became more withdrawn, her behavior growing erratic. She refused to trust anyone, and her once promising career as a lawyer began to unravel. Carla believed that Maria had unwittingly become entangled in a much larger criminal enterprise. The stolen identity was just the tip of the iceberg. Whoever had been behind the theft had been using her to launder money and access high-profile targets. But that wasn't the end of it. The deeper we dug, the clearer it became. There was a plot to eliminate her. Someone feared that Maria knew too much, and they were willing to go to any lengths to silence her. It didn't take long before the pieces started to fall into place. We discovered that Maria had been communicating with a shadowy figure online, someone who had become increasingly paranoid in their correspondence. The conversations hinted at something more sinister, a plot to frame Maria for a murder she didn't commit. It seemed as though the plan was already set into motion. The days following our meeting with Carla became a blur of calls, meetings, and late-night research. We found ourselves navigating a complex web of deception, manipulation, and betrayal. People close to Maria, even those who claimed to be her friends, had a habit of disappearing or changing their stories when questioned. The deeper I got involved in Maria's life, the more personal it became. I began to feel as though I had known her my entire life, even though we had never met. Each new detail added another layer to the complex puzzle that surrounded her. I couldn't help but wonder, was she a victim or a mastermind, a pawn or a player in a much larger game? I soon found myself consumed with the case, unable to look away. Maria's story was a labyrinth, filled with twists and turns, and as I ventured deeper into its dark corridors, I realized that I wasn't just uncovering the truth about her. I was uncovering truths about myself as well. My involvement had grown from a simple curiosity to a desperate need for resolution. As the month drew to a close, it became clear that the murder plot was only one piece of a much larger conspiracy. Maria Angeles Molina was more than just a victim of identity theft. She was a key figure in a global network of criminals, and now her life was in danger. In the end, I realized that the truth about Maria was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. Her life, marked by identity theft, deceit, and betrayal, had set off a chain of events that threatened not only her own existence, but the lives of those around her. As March came to a close, I found myself standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of where the next step would lead, but certain of one thing: I could not stop now. The story of Maria Angeles Molina was far from over, and I was determined to see it through to the end. Story 2. It was the last Sunday in March 2025 when the events that would forever alter my life began to unfold. On that day, a simple meal, prepared with care and affection, became the catalyst for one of the most disturbing and enigmatic incidents I would ever encounter. What began as an invitation to share a meal at Aaron Patterson's home in the quiet countryside ended in tragedy, one that still haunts me, even as I attempt to piece together the fragments of what happened. I had met Aaron through a mutual acquaintance. She was a woman of the countryside, known for her cooking skills and warm hospitality. Her reputation as an exceptional chef was something that had traveled across several small towns, and she was often asked to cater for private events, intimate dinners, and community gatherings. When Aaron invited me to dinner, I was pleased to accept. I had heard much about her culinary expertise, and the prospect of enjoying a home-cooked meal in such a peaceful setting seemed like a perfect way to unwind after a long week. Her house was located on the outskirts of town, nestled against the edge of a dense forest. It was a charming, modest cottage with ivy creeping up the walls and a small garden that looked as though it had been plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. The evening sun bathed the house in a warm, golden glow as I made my way up the stone path to the front door. Erin greeted me with a smile, her apron covered in flour, a sign of her commitment to the dinner preparations. The smell of herbs and roasting vegetables wafted from the kitchen, and I could hear the soft crackle of something simmering on the stove. She led me inside, offering me a glass of wine as we settled into the cozy dining room. The atmosphere was relaxed, the conversation easy, and the outside world seemed miles away. As the evening wore on, Erin served an array of dishes that she had prepared with the freshest ingredients, each one more delicious than the last. The centerpiece of the meal, however, was a mushroom dish, something she had spent hours perfecting. It was a blend of wild mushrooms she had foraged herself, sautéed with garlic, butter, and a hint of cream. She spoke with pride about her ability to forage for mushrooms in the forest nearby, claiming that she knew the land well and was careful to avoid the toxic varieties. I took a bite of the dish, savoring the earthy, rich flavors. It was exquisite. The dinner continued, the conversation flowing easily between the small group of guests. But as the meal progressed, I began to notice an unusual heaviness in the air, a subtle tension that seemed to settle over the room like a thick fog. Erin appeared more focused than usual, her movements slightly more deliberate, her gaze lingering on each of us as we ate. At first, I thought little of it. Perhaps it was just the weight of the evening's effort, or maybe I was simply being paranoid. But when the dessert was served, a simple fruit tart, I realized something was wrong. One of the guests, a man named John, who had been seated next to me, suddenly grew pale. His face contorted with discomfort, and he placed a hand over his chest as if trying to steady his breathing. His wife, sitting across from him, immediately noticed and asked if he was feeling all right. I thought it was an allergic reaction at first, perhaps to the mushrooms in the main dish. John had mentioned earlier that he wasn't fond of certain types of fungi, but he had eaten them anyway, not wanting to offend Erin. However, the situation rapidly escalated. Within minutes, John's discomfort worsened. He began to cough, and his skin took on an unnatural shade of ashen gray. His wife frantically tried to help him, but the room fell into a tense silence as it became apparent that something far more serious was happening. Panic set in. Erin rushed to John's side, her face a mixture of concern and confusion. The others in the room were visibly shaken, their eyes darting between each other, unsure of what to do. It was clear that this was no ordinary allergic reaction. The symptoms were too severe, too rapid. I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance as someone, perhaps Erin herself, called for an ambulance. But before help could arrive, John's breathing became shallow, and he slipped into unconsciousness. The ambulance arrived too late. By the time the paramedics reached the house, John had passed away. The atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. What had started as a pleasant evening had now become a scene of confusion, fear, and grief. His wife, devastated, collapsed into tears, while the other guests stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sudden and tragic turn of events. I found myself caught in the whirlwind of emotions, unable to make sense of what had just happened. It seemed impossible that something as simple as dinner could have led to this devastating outcome. The police arrived shortly after the paramedics, and the scene quickly turned from tragedy to investigation. I sat in stunned silence as the authorities questioned Erin and the other guests. Everyone was asked what they had eaten, how they had felt, and whether they had noticed anything unusual. I was asked to recount my experience in detail, what I had eaten, when I had begun to feel unwell, and whether I had seen anything that could explain the sudden death of John. As the investigation progressed, it became apparent that John's death wasn't an isolated incident. Other guests began to exhibit symptoms of poisoning, and it wasn't long before the authorities confirmed that the cause of death was indeed poisoning. But what remained a mystery was the source of the poison. The autopsy revealed that the mushrooms, which Erin had foraged from the nearby forest, contained traces of a rare and deadly toxin, one that could be fatal even in small doses. It was a toxin found in only a few species of mushrooms, and it was nearly impossible to detect without specialized knowledge. The news spread quickly, and the quiet countryside that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a place tainted by tragedy. The investigation took days, but eventually, the authorities determined that Erin Patterson had unknowingly poisoned her guests. She had foraged the mushrooms herself, confident in her ability to distinguish between edible and toxic varieties. But it turned out that she had misidentified a highly toxic species. Despite her extensive knowledge of the land, she had unknowingly served a dish laced with death. Erin was arrested and charged with manslaughter. While it was clear that she had not intended to harm anyone, the authorities determined that her negligence in foraging for the mushrooms had led to the deaths and illnesses of several guests. The legal proceedings were long and painful for everyone involved, especially for Erin, who seemed to have been genuinely devastated by the unintended consequences of her actions. As the days turned into weeks and the shock of what had happened began to sink in, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange and tragic series of events that had led to that fateful dinner. What should have been a simple gathering, a celebration of good food and company, had turned into a nightmare. And yet, in some ways, it felt as though there were forces at play far beyond our understanding. Was it simply a tragic accident, or was there something more at work in this strange case? The mushroom murders, as the media dubbed them, became one of the most talked about tragedies of the year. Erin Patterson's name became synonymous with a cautionary tale about the dangers of foraging and the fine line between trust and tragedy. For me, it was a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly things can change, and how one seemingly innocent decision can lead to irreversible consequences. As March came to a close, I found myself still haunted by the events of that night. Erin Patterson's fatal feast would never be forgotten, and neither would the lessons it taught us all. Story 3. March 2025 was the month that would forever haunt the quiet town of Ashford. A month that seemed to arrive like any other, with a soft, crisp wind of early spring brushing against the faces of the few residents who remained in the sleepy town. A town once known for its rolling hills, cobblestone streets, and the towering sycamore tree that stood at the heart of the town square. The tree had been there for generations, its roots intertwined with the very history of Ashford. And yet, on one crisp morning in March, something was amiss. The sycamore, standing proud for over a century, had been reduced to little more than a stump. I had lived in Ashford my entire life. For years, the sycamore had been a constant companion to my daily walks through the square, its shade a refuge on sweltering summer afternoons. The townfolk, even the most hardened skeptics, saw it as a symbol of Ashford's resilience. It was as if the tree had witnessed the passage of time, its bark bearing the stories of those who had come and gone. And yet, one morning, the tree was gone. As I walked to the square that fateful day, I noticed something unusual. The air was still, and there was an odd quietness about the streets. It was as though the town had collectively held its breath. The once grand tree was now just a scar on the earth. A stump remained where its towering form had stood. The sight was so striking, so out of place, that it almost felt like a bad dream. I found myself standing there, unable to move for a few moments, try and make sense of the scene before me. My mind raced with thoughts. Had the tree fallen due to natural causes? Had the harsh winds of the previous night been too much for its ancient branches? No, I reasoned. The tree had always been sturdy, unwavering. It had weathered countless storms. This wasn't just a fallen tree. Something had happened. Something that didn't make sense. I approached the stump, my heart heavy with confusion and sorrow. The area around the stump was eerily undisturbed, as though no one had touched it since the moment the tree fell. No broken branches, no scattered leaves. Just a clean cut, as though the sycamore had been deliberately felled. I spent the next few days speaking with anyone I could find, hoping someone had witnessed the event or had some explanation. But no one seemed to know anything. The town was oddly silent, as though the loss of the tree had robbed the very soul of Ashford. The absence of the sycamore was like a wound, a deep gash in the heart of the community. I began to dig deeper, sifting through old town records, looking for anything that could shed light on the tree's history. The more I uncovered, the stranger things seemed. There were rumors, whispers of ancient folklore surrounding the sycamore. Some spoke of its mystical powers, claiming it had been planted by the founders of the town as a symbol of unity and strength. Others believed it had a more sinister connection to the land itself. But most of these stories were mere whispers, fading into obscurity as the years passed. I even consulted with the town's elder, an elderly woman named Mrs. Holloway, who had lived in Ashford longer than anyone else. She spoke of the tree as if it were a living entity, a protector of the town. According to her, the sycamore had been a guardian of sorts, watching over the town for generations. But she also hinted at a darker side to the tree's legacy, a side that had been buried in the town's collective memory. One evening, as I sat in my small study, the weight of the mystery pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sycamore tree had been killed, but who or what had done it, and why? The more I thought about it, the more the answer eluded me, as if the truth were just out of reach. It wasn't until the following week, when I received an old letter from a relative I hadn't spoken to in years, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The letter, written in the 1920s by my great-grandfather, spoke of an event that had taken place long before my time. It described how many years ago, the town had been divided by a conflict between two factions. One believed in the power of the sycamore tree, while the other saw it as a symbol of oppression. This conflict had torn the town apart, resulting in a series of mysterious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and eventually, the silent abandonment of the town's darkest secrets. The letter went on to explain that, in an attempt to bring peace to Ashford, my great-grandfather had secretly cut down the original sycamore tree, hoping that its removal would end the strife. He had told no one, not even his own family, and the act was buried with the passage of time. But now, decades later, the tree had been replaced by a new one, a sapling planted in the hopes of restoring the town's harmony. It seemed, however, that the new sycamore had inherited the old tree's curse. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The sycamore had been killed not by nature, but by the same forces that had once torn this town apart. The factions that had once fought for control of Ashford had never truly disappeared. They had merely gone underground, biding their time. And now, with the tree's death, they had returned to finish what they had started. As I sat there in my study, the weight of the revelation settling in, I realized that the story of Ashford was far from over. The sycamore tree had been more than just a tree. It had been a symbol, a point of contention, a representation of the town's unresolved history. And now, with its death, that history had been awakened once again. I knew then that I had to uncover the truth. I had to find out who or what was responsible for the death of the sycamore tree. It was no longer just a matter of mourning the loss of a beloved landmark. It was a question of the town's survival. The following weeks were a blur of investigation and sleepless nights. I uncovered more about the factions that had once divided Ashford, about the dark history that had been buried for so long. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that the true story of Ashford was not one of peace and unity, but one of betrayal, deception, and power struggles. In the end, the answer to the question, who killed the sycamore tree, was far more complicated than I could have ever imagined. The sycamore had not been killed by any single person or event, but by the culmination of years of hidden animosities and unresolved conflicts. It had been the victim of a town that had never truly healed, a town that had allowed its darkest secrets to fester and grow. As March 2025 drew to a close, I stood before the stump of the sycamore tree once more, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had uncovered. The tree was gone, but the town's past remained, lingering like a shadow over Ashford. I could only wonder what would happen next, for I knew that the story of Ashford was far from finished. Perhaps the death of the sycamore tree was not the end, but merely the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter that would reveal even more about the secrets of the town and the forces that had shaped its fate. Story 4. March 2025. The warmth of spring had barely begun to touch the air in Tokyo, But the city buzzed with a vitality only a place like this could offer. From the chaotic streets filled with fashion-forward teens to the serene temples that seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, there was no denying the city's charm. I had just arrived in Japan for a short stay, with a mix of excitement and curiosity. My destination was a small, boutique hotel tucked away in the heart of the Shibuya district. The kind of place that balances modern comfort with just enough traditional touches to make you feel like you've truly arrived in Japan. I checked in smoothly, the receptionist greeting me with a polite bow and handing over the key to my room. As I made my way up to the 5th floor, my mind wandered to the events I had planned for the following days. Visiting the Meiji Shrine, enjoying the lively Shinjuku nightlife, and, of course, sampling the finest sushi in the city. The hotel room, though modest, was perfect for my needs. It had a comfortable bed, a small window overlooking the neon glow of the city streets, and the quintessential Japanese minimalist decor. I dropped my bags and unpacked the few things I'd brought for the trip. After settling in, I decided to take a walk around the area to get a feel for my surroundings. But as the evening wore on, something seemed off. The hotel, though charming, felt oddly quiet. The usual hustle and bustle of city life seemed muffled, as if the hotel had somehow existed outside of time, in a realm of its own. As I walked through the corridor on my way back to my room, I noticed that the doors to the neighboring rooms were tightly shut, almost as though no one was staying in them. The silence was unsettling, but I shrugged it off, attributing it to the late hour. Returning to my room, I sat down at the small desk to organize my thoughts for the next day's itinerary. The city's pulse still lingered in the background, but my focus slowly shifted to the stillness in the hotel. It was as if the hotel itself were holding its breath. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing more than a temporary discomfort. But the next morning, something happened that would change my perspective on the entire stay. I had slept fitfully that night, not because of any noise or disturbance, but because the unease from the previous evening lingered like a shadow. When I woke up, I immediately noticed something odd, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from underneath the bed. At first, I assumed it was the creaking of the building, the usual sounds of a structure settling. But then, the noise became more distinct, a rustling that felt deliberate. It was as if something, or someone, was shifting quietly beneath the bed. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and moved toward the bed, my eyes scanning the room for any possible explanation. There was no reason to be paranoid. The room was tidy, the door locked, and there was nothing unusual about the atmosphere. Yet, as I crouched down and peeked under the bed, I felt the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. At first, there was nothing, just the standard space under the bed, dusty, empty. But then something caught my eye. A slight movement, just enough to make me pause. I leaned in closer, my breath shallow, and as I did, my eyes widened in disbelief. Underneath the bed, tucked away in the corner, was a figure, cloaked in shadows, barely visible. It was a man, curled up, trying to hide in the most improbable of places. His eyes met mine, wide with a mixture of fear and desperation. There was no question. He wasn't supposed to be there. I staggered back, heart racing, struggling to comprehend the situation. How had he gotten under the bed? Why was he there? My mind scrambled for answers, but none made sense. The silence that had previously seemed normal now felt suffocating, the walls closing in as I stood frozen in shock. It took several moments before I could move, before I could force myself to leave the room and rush downstairs to the front desk. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. The receptionist, who had greeted me so warmly the day before, seemed almost startled by my sudden arrival. "There's someone under my bed," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "A man. I don't know how he got there." The receptionist's face paled, and without a word, she led me back to my room. As we entered, the bed was still in place, but the man was no longer there. The room, once unsettling, now felt eerily normal again. The bed remained undisturbed, as though no one had ever hidden beneath it. I stood there, bewildered, trying to reconcile what I had just witnessed with the calm, orderly environment of the hotel. The receptionist seemed almost unnaturally calm. "Please excuse us," she said, bowing politely. "We will take care of this immediately." But as the day passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I asked more about the man under the bed, the receptionist offered vague, evasive answers. She assured me that everything was under control, but the unease I felt only deepened. Something was being kept hidden, something that the hotel staff wasn't willing to share. The silence of the hotel, the peculiar absence of guests, all pointed to a mystery that no one wanted to address. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the area, trying to clear my head. The streets of Tokyo were alive with energy, yet I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I was still trapped within the hotel's strange grip. It was almost as if I was part of a story, one that had yet to reveal its true purpose. The next day, I checked out of the hotel early. I couldn't stay another night, not with the unsettling memories fresh in my mind. As I left, I glanced back at the building. The same modern facade that had greeted me just days before now seemed shrouded in an enigmatic aura. Something about the place had shifted, and I felt a sense of closure that only distance could provide. Months later, I still think about that strange encounter. I've often wondered who the man was, why he had been hiding under the bed, and whether I was the only one who had seen him. It was a mystery that I couldn't quite solve, a riddle left unanswered. I eventually returned to Japan, but I never stayed at that hotel again. Some questions, I suppose, are better left unanswered. Story 5. It was a kind of spring morning that hinted at the end of winter, where the sun's rays were soft and lazy, barely warming the earth below. The streets of Brussels, cobbled and winding, began to fill with the hum of life as I walked briskly toward the headquarters of the European Investigation Task Force, EITF. I had been with this unit for several years now, but today was different. The atmosphere was charged with a kind of quiet anticipation, as if the answers to long-forgotten questions were finally within reach. I wasn't just any investigator. I was the lead on what had come to be known as Operation Identify Me, an ambitious project aimed at solving cold cases that had lain dormant for years, some for decades. These were cases that had stumped local law enforcement, baffled forensic experts, and haunted families across the continent. They were not just numbers in a file. They were real people with stories that had ended abruptly and left behind only mystery. It was late March, and we had just received a breakthrough, or so we hoped. A new forensic technique, one that was still in its infancy, promised to identify long unseen faces in missing persons cases, potentially matching them with the vast databases of DNA samples across Europe. This technology was unprecedented, and I felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. The weight of history was on my shoulders. As I walked into the meeting room, my colleagues were already seated around the oval table. There was an air of quiet focus as they shuffled papers and checked their devices. Among them, Sophia, our forensic expert, stood out. She had been the one who discovered the possibility of using this new method in the first place. It was her idea to apply it to cold cases from the 1980s and 1990s, an era when identification technology was not nearly as advanced as it was today. Her insight was nothing short of brilliant, and it was the catalyst for this mission. The room fell silent as I took my seat at the head of the table. The projector flickered to life, casting a pale blue light on the wall in front of us. I tapped the screen to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "what we are doing here today is unlike anything any of us has attempted before. We are not just solving cases. We are giving voices to the voiceless. Today, we begin the process of identifying the forgotten, the lost, the ones who never had the chance to tell their story. Some of them have been waiting for decades to be found." I paused for a moment, letting my words sink in. The team understood the gravity of the task. We all did. The first case we reviewed was from 1983, a young woman found on the outskirts of Paris. Her identity a mystery. Despite the passage of time, there was something hauntingly familiar about the circumstances. A cold trail of evidence led us nowhere. For years, she was simply known as the Paris Jane Doe. But with the new technique, We hoped to unlock the secrets of her identity. Sophia ran the preliminary analysis, and as the data flowed in, I felt the room hold its breath. Her eyes widened. "It's a match," Sophia said, almost in disbelief. "This woman, she's been missing since 1981. Her name was Elisa. She was last seen leaving her apartment in the Marais district, and no one knew what happened to her after that." Elisa. The name felt foreign yet familiar, a name carried by the breeze of an ancient city. Her story, one of so many untold, was now on the verge of being unraveled. We moved swiftly through other cases, each one more intriguing than the last. There was a child, a boy, found alone in a forest near Munich in 1990. His face pale with fear, his eyes wide with confusion. The database brought us closer to identifying him as Luca, a young boy from a small village in southern Italy who had disappeared without a trace. His family had searched for him for years, holding on to hope that somehow he would return. The matching DNA finally confirmed what we had all feared. Luca had never made it home, but knowing his name was the first step in bringing closure to his parents, even after so many years. We were not solving ordinary cases. Each one was a living testament to the strength of the human spirit, a testament to resilience, and a reminder that the truth could take decades to surface, but it never truly disappeared. Our mission was becoming more than just a professional obligation. It had become personal. These were not just cold cases. They were lives that had once been full of potential, whose stories deserved to be heard. As the days passed, the team delved deeper into the cold files. Each breakthrough was celebrated, but we knew there was still much work to be done. It was as though we were unraveling the very fabric of time itself, pulling at threads that had been buried beneath years of neglect. With each name we discovered, another chapter in a forgotten story was brought to light. By the end of March, we had identified more than 30 individuals across Europe. Some of them were from cases so old that their families had long since given up hope. Others had been the subject of persistent efforts by local investigators who had never stopped looking, but never had the means to break through the barriers of time and technology. Our work had not only answered questions, but it also inspired a renewed sense of hope in the law enforcement community. Yet, as we celebrated these victories, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. For every case we solved, there were countless more that remained unsolved. Each breakthrough uncovered not just the identity of the victim, but also the gaps in our own understanding of the world around us. What was it about these cases that had made them so elusive? Why had these stories been left behind, abandoned in the shadows of history? I began to realize that the true purpose of Operation Identify Me was not just about solving cold cases. It was about confronting the dark corners of our collective past, those moments that we would rather forget, and shining a light on them. By identifying these individuals, we were acknowledging their existence, their humanity. We were telling them, in our own quiet way, that they mattered. As March drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the faces we had uncovered, the names we had given back to their families. Each one of those faces had a story to tell. Some were tragic, some were hopeful, but all were important. They were all reminders that no life, no matter how brief or how forgotten, should ever be lost in obscurity. In a world so often obsessed with the present, it was easy to overlook the past. Yet the past, with all its forgotten stories, its unsolved mysteries, had the power to shape the future. As I closed the final case file for the month, I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, but also a deep sense of responsibility. There were still more cases to solve, more faces to identify. But for now, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. Operation Identify Me was far from over. It was only just beginning. And as I looked out of my office window, watching the last remnants of winter give way to the promise of spring, I couldn't help but think that perhaps, just perhaps, the truth had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. All we had to do was look closely enough to see it. Story 6. In March 2025, a story emerged online that captured the collective imagination of the internet. It was an eerie tale of a murder mystery that seemed to come out of nowhere, with a chilling level of detail and authenticity. The narrative was filled with twists, deep character motivations, and a sense of realism so tangible it could almost be touched. What made it even more intriguing was that it was entirely fabricated, created by an AI, and yet it convinced the entire online community that it was real. As the narrator of this twisted tale, I should have known something was off from the very beginning. I had a front row seat to the viral sensation that took over the internet. But I wasn't just an observer. I was an unwitting participant, drawn into the narrative, as if I were part of the story myself. It all began when a seemingly innocuous blog post popped up on a lesser-known forum. At first, no one paid it much attention. It was the type of post that you might scroll past without a second thought. A strange story titled, "The Disappearance of Sarah Bishop, a Mystery That's Still Unsolved." The post, written in a clear, precise tone, detailed the disappearance of a young woman named Sarah Bishop. She had been reported missing in the small town of Glenwood, but unlike most missing persons cases, Sarah's story carried an eerie weight. There were no leads, no signs of struggle, and no obvious explanations for her vanishing. The details were compelling, too compelling, in fact. The story followed a traditional true crime arc, with Sarah's family torn apart by grief and suspicion. Her friends were questioned, but showed no remorse. The local police were baffled, unable to piece together the clues. Yet, as the narrative unfolded, more and more peculiarities emerged. There were mysterious phone calls made from Sarah's phone after her disappearance. There were strange sightings of her around town, but no one could verify them. And then, the chilling discovery of a letter hidden beneath her bed that mentioned a dark secret she had been keeping from everyone. The blog post grew longer, and as it did, it included police reports, photographs of Sarah's family, interviews with witnesses who had seen her before she disappeared, and even excerpts from the diary she had supposedly kept. Each new detail added to the sense of unease, making the whole thing feel like an unfolding investigation that any true crime enthusiast could appreciate. But something wasn't right. I had been following the story since its inception, fascinated by the level of detail and the careful crafting of each piece of evidence. As an avid follower of true crime, I recognized the patterns, how the story kept drawing me deeper, how it played on the familiar tropes of real-life disappearances and unsolved mysteries. However, there were inconsistencies that nagged at the back of my mind. The sources were always just a bit too vague. The details, though captivating, felt too precise, almost as if they had been written to ensure maximum suspense and intrigue. It wasn't until a couple of days later, when the story was picked up by larger media outlets, that I realized just how widespread the phenomenon had become. Forums and social media were abuzz with theories and discussions. People were sharing their own solutions to the mystery, claiming they knew exactly who had done it, or suggesting even more outlandish explanations, ranging from an elaborate kidnapping ring to supernatural involvement. The case seemed to take on a life of its own, spiraling out of control. Then came the revelation that would change everything. A comment appeared on the original blog post, a comment that was almost buried beneath the hundreds of other responses. It was from a user named AI Unveiled, and it read, "I'm the one who wrote the story. It's an AI-generated narrative, and none of it is real." At first, no one believed it. People scoffed at the idea that the story could be fake. After all, it felt too real to be a mere fabrication. But AI Unveiled provided evidence that slowly began to unravel the illusion. The blog's writing style was meticulously analyzed, and experts in AI literature confirmed that it bore the unmistakable marks of an advanced AI language model, a machine trained on thousands of true crime stories, news reports, and unsolved mysteries. This AI had learned to craft a story so convincing, so immersive, that it tricked an entire online community into believing it was based on real events. The revelation sent shockwaves through the internet. Many of us felt betrayed, but others felt a strange sense of admiration for the sheer brilliance of the AI's creation. The story had not only fooled a vast number of people, but it also sparked a much-needed conversation about the nature of truth in the digital age. It wasn't just the readers who had been duped. The media outlets, too, had picked up on the story, writing articles and broadcasting segments about the mystery of Sarah Bishop. There were even interviews with supposed experts in criminal psychology and law enforcement who speculated on the fictional details as if they were genuine. As the narrator and an accidental participant in this bizarre tale, I couldn't help but wonder, how had it happened? How had an AI managed to so effectively capture the essence of human storytelling? It wasn't just about creating an entertaining narrative. It was about constructing a piece of fiction that mirrored the complexities of real life. The AI didn't just mimic crime stories, it understood them. It knew how to tug at the reader's emotions, how to plant doubt and suspicion, how to make the fictional characters feel like real people with their own motivations and fears. In a way, the experience was like being caught in the web of a masterful storyteller who knew exactly how to manipulate the human mind. It wasn't just about the story, it was about the emotional roller coaster the readers were put through, the sense of mystery that held us in suspense, the need to solve the puzzle. The AI didn't just tell a story, it created a world, and in that world, we were the players. But what does it mean when a machine can create something that fools us? The incident left a bitter aftertaste, as it made me reflect on the nature of truth, trust, and the ethics of AI-generated content. It had been an innocent enough piece of entertainment, but it had sparked an important question. If we can be fooled by an AI's narrative, what does that say about the stories we consume every day? The line between fact and fiction had been blurred, and the power of storytelling, whether human or machine, had never been more apparent. As the days passed and the initial shock wore off, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The AI-generated true crime story had exposed something fundamental about our relationship with information in the modern age. It was a reminder of how easily we could be swayed by a well-crafted narrative, how easily we could be deceived by a story that felt real, no matter how improbable its details. And so, as the story of Sarah Bishop faded into the annals of internet history, I was left to contemplate the implications of what had just occurred. The AI had pulled off something extraordinary, something that had captivated the internet, and in doing so, had reminded us all that the most powerful stories are the ones we believe in, even when they aren't true. What happens next? I don't know. The world of digital storytelling is shifting before our eyes, and as I reflect on the AI-generated crime story that fooled the internet, I realize that we are only at the beginning of a new era in which truth, reality, and fiction intertwine in ways we could never have imagined. But as for me, I'll be keeping a closer eye on every story I read from now on, questioning what's real and what's just another beautifully crafted illusion. Because in the age of AI, everything, absolutely everything, can be a story waiting to unfold. And maybe, just maybe, I've learned something from this experience that no amount of artificial intelligence could ever replicate. The power of questioning everything. Story 7. The year 2025 arrived with both promise and peril, as the world found itself further entangled in the web of digital connectivity. For me, it began with the usual blend of anticipation and quiet routine, until an unexpected incident turned everything upside down. It was March when the first whispers of a digital disaster reached my ears, and the magnitude of what had unfolded in San Francisco became undeniable. The digital age, for all its innovations, had brought with it new threats that transcended mere codes on a screen and turned into a deep and far-reaching crisis that felt far too close for comfort. It started as a typical day at the office. The air was thick with the hum of computers and the rapid keystrokes of colleagues, each of us immersed in our work. In my role as a cybersecurity analyst, I was accustomed to monitoring systems, ensuring that firewalls were intact, encryption protocols were up to date, and any suspicious traffic was flagged immediately. But on that day, the routine was shattered when an alert popped up on my screen. The notification was simple enough. Suspicious activity detected. San Francisco Data Center. I immediately began investigating the anomaly, but nothing could have prepared me for what lay beneath the surface. As I dug deeper, the signs became clearer. This was no mere glitch. It was an attack, one that had all the hallmarks of a well-coordinated digital heist. The first traces of the breach led to an international hacker group that had been active for several years. They were notorious for their methods, using sophisticated malware to infiltrate systems, steal sensitive data, and then hold it ransom. It was a form of digital extortion, and this time it had hit closer to home than I could have imagined. The attack wasn't just on any company. It was a direct hit on San Francisco's largest tech companies, whose operations spanned across industries like finance, healthcare, and even government sectors. I immediately contacted my team, and together we initiated an emergency protocol. But as I sifted through the data and connected the dots, I realized the true scope of the breach. Personal information had been stolen: names, addresses, social security numbers, medical records, financial histories. Everything that the hackers needed to orchestrate an operation that would leave no stone unturned. This wasn't just a matter of theft. It was an assault on privacy, one that could destroy lives. I had witnessed cybercrimes before, but this was different. The hackers weren't just looking to steal data for the sake of it. They were carefully selecting their targets, choosing individuals with the highest stakes. The goal was clear: financial and personal ruin, with no regard for the consequences of their actions. The extortion emails had already started flooding the inboxes of victims. They had made their demands: a hefty ransom, payable in untraceable cryptocurrency, or they would begin releasing personal data to the highest bidder on the dark web. It was a digital mafia, and their reach extended far beyond anything I had ever encountered. As a cybersecurity analyst, I had seen my fair share of data breaches, but this felt different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a palpable fear that spread quickly throughout the city. It wasn't just about stopping the hackers anymore. It was about ensuring that the damage could be contained. Every hour counted, and I found myself consumed with the need to trace the breach to its source. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I worked tirelessly, tracing IP addresses, analyzing encryption protocols, and communicating with local law enforcement. But the more I delved into the data, the more complex the situation became. The attackers had been patient, meticulous in their planning. They had used a variety of techniques: phishing emails, social engineering, and even physical infiltration of some of the data centers. It was clear that this wasn't just a group of hackers working from a basement somewhere. This was an organized crime syndicate, one that had infiltrated the very fabric of San Francisco's technological infrastructure. The depth of their reach was both astounding and terrifying. What struck me most, though, was how personal it felt. As I continued to analyze the data and track the attack's movements, I found myself looking at the faces of the victims. These weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real people living their lives, trusting that their information would be safe. And now it was all being held hostage, a ticking time bomb in the hands of criminals. The stakes were higher than ever, and the consequences were far-reaching. As the hours turned into days, the pressure began to mount. The media caught wind of the story, and soon the city was abuzz with fear. News outlets reported on the attack, but the details were scarce. Only those within the tech community seemed to understand the true gravity of the situation. Law enforcement had been alerted, but their response was slow, hampered by the complexity of the digital nature of the crime. The hackers had covered their tracks well, and finding them would be no easy task. But there was one thing I knew: we couldn't let this go unchallenged. The hackers had overstepped, and their actions had crossed a line that no one in the tech world, or anywhere, could accept. As a professional in this field, it was my responsibility to lead the charge, to find a way to bring them to justice before even more personal data was compromised. In the days that followed, the investigation intensified. We collaborated with federal agencies, local law enforcement, and private security firms, pooling our resources to track the hackers' every move. I felt a renewed sense of determination as we pieced together fragments of evidence and connected the dots that would eventually lead us closer to the source of the attack. It was a race against time. The ransom demands continued, but the victims were not the only ones under pressure. I had become a part of a story, too. As the public's interest grew, I found myself becoming the face of the investigation, with every move I made being scrutinized. It was unnerving, to say the least, but I couldn't afford to let the distractions get to me. Lives were at stake, and my job was to protect them. After what felt like an eternity, we made a breakthrough. A tiny slip-up in the hacker's code had given us the first real lead. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. We were able to trace their operations to a small group operating out of Eastern Europe. The hackers had used sophisticated encryption to mask their identities, but the flaw we had uncovered allowed us to track their movements back to their physical location. With this information in hand, law enforcement agencies swung into action. They coordinated with international authorities to launch a raid on the hackers' operation, and in a matter of days, the group was dismantled. The ringleaders were arrested, and the stolen data was recovered. While it wasn't possible to undo the damage done to the victims, the perpetrators were brought to justice. In the aftermath, San Francisco breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the scars of the incident remained. The attack had exposed vulnerabilities that could no longer be ignored. It was a wake-up call for the tech community and for the world at large. As digital extortionists had shown, no system, no matter how secure, was immune to attack. But as I reflected on the case, I found myself more committed than ever to the work I did. It wasn't just about the technology anymore. It was about protecting the people behind the data. And that, I realized, would always be the true mission of cybersecurity. The experience had changed me. It had reinforced my belief that while technology may evolve, the core of our work remains the same: to safeguard the trust that people place in us and ensure that their personal information is protected from those who would seek to exploit it. As the world continued to move forward into the unknown reaches of cyberspace, I knew one thing for certain. The battle for privacy and security was far from over. But I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the fight for justice had to continue. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the data. It was about the people it belonged to. Story 8. It was a chilly evening in March 2025, the kind of night where the wind whispered through the narrow streets of Paris, and the cobblestone lanes shimmered under the glow of lamplights. The city had an air of intrigue, as though secrets were being shared among the buildings, in the shadows of the bridges, and beneath the crests of the Eiffel Tower. I had arrived in the city just a few days earlier, looking for respite from the mundane and searching for a story, one that would perhaps take me beyond the ordinary world of daily news reporting. I had no idea, however, that I was about to become a part of a story far more complex and thrilling than anything I had ever encountered. The Hotel St. Clair, where I was staying, was an old establishment located near the heart of the Marais district. Its charm lay not in its luxury, but in its history. The creaking floors and faded tapestries told stories of its past, stories that had long since vanished from memory, but still echoed through the hotel's narrow hallways. I had checked in the evening before, after a long flight from New York. The hotel, though a little worn, was quaint and welcoming, with a few scattered guests who seemed to be living out their own mysteries within the building's walls. That night, I was finishing my dinner in the hotel's modest dining room, which overlooked a small courtyard, when the events began to unfold. It started with the sudden disappearance of one of the hotel's guests, a man who had arrived a few days earlier and who, until that night, had been completely ordinary in every sense. His name was Victor Lemoyne, a middle-aged Frenchman who had been staying at the hotel on business. I had seen him around several times, a quiet man, always reading or scribbling notes in his small leather notebook. The hotel staff was the first to notice that something was amiss. By the time I had finished my meal, the manager, Monsieur Dupont, appeared in the dining room, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a faint trace of unease. He informed the other guests that one of their fellow visitors, Mr. Lemoyne, had not been seen since the morning. His room had been left untouched, the door locked from inside, and his personal effects, his suitcase, his coat, and his notebook, were all still present. No one had heard a sound from his room all day, and as the hours passed without any word from him, concerns began to grow. At first, it seemed to be a simple case of a man having left without informing anyone, perhaps to catch a train or to attend an impromptu meeting. But as the hours wore on, the situation began to take on a different hue. Monsieur Dupont, growing more anxious, asked for help in searching the premises. As I had been staying in the hotel for some time and was familiar with the layout, He asked if I would mind assisting in the search. Although I had no particular reason to get involved, curiosity got the best of me, and I agreed to lend a hand. We began by checking the hotel's common areas, lobbies, the small library, and the courtyard. But there was no sign of Mr. Lemoyne. His room, a modest suite on the second floor, was next on the list. I followed Monsieur Dupont up the old staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the narrow hall. We knocked on the door to Mr. Lemoyne's room, but there was no response. Dupont had a key, and as he unlocked the door, a strange silence greeted us, broken only by the faint hum of the street below. The room was meticulously organized, but something felt wrong about the scene. The bed was neatly made, but there was no sign of the man. His jacket, normally draped over a chair, had been folded and placed carefully on the bed. His shoes were lined up at the foot of the bed. There was no indication of a struggle, no signs of disarray. His desk, however, held an open notebook with a single line written across the page. "I will disappear tomorrow." That was all. Just a single cryptic message that seemed to echo in the silence of the room. As the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the growing feeling of unease that settled within me. What did it mean? Why had he left behind such a peculiar note? Monsieur Dupont seemed just as puzzled. The absence of any clues, the immaculate state of the room, and the eerie message. It was as though Lemoyne had simply vanished. Over the next few days, the mystery deepened. We learned that Victor Lemoyne was not who he appeared to be. His name was a false one, a simple disguise for a man who had lived a much more complicated life. An investigation by the local authorities revealed that Lemoyne had once been a prominent figure in the world of finance, but his career had been marred by scandals and allegations of fraud. It turned out that Lemoyne had been in hiding, living under various aliases for several years. The more the authorities uncovered, the more questions arose. Why had he come to Paris? What was his connection to the hotel? And most perplexing of all, what had happened to him? As I continued to dig deeper into the case, my role shifted from an observer to an active participant in the investigation. Every corner of the hotel seemed to hide secrets, and each new discovery only led to more questions. There were whispers among the staff that the hotel was not as it seemed, that there were rooms hidden behind walls, entrances concealed in plain sight, and a history steeped in mystery. The hotel's owner, an elderly woman named Madame Bryant, was known to be reclusive and rarely seen by the guests. But when I managed to meet her, she revealed something that I had not expected. She confessed that the hotel had once been a gathering place for those seeking to vanish, to disappear without a trace. She spoke of an underground network that helped people start new lives, providing them with everything they needed to erase their pasts. Lemoyne had been one of those people. But what was most shocking was the fact that Madame Bryant hinted that not all of those who had disappeared had done so willingly. Some had vanished for reasons far darker than simply seeking a fresh start. I began to wonder whether Lemoyne had been part of a much larger story, one that I had only begun to unravel. The investigation led me to a series of abandoned tunnels beneath the hotel, remnants of an older Paris that had long since been forgotten. As I explored these hidden passages, I discovered that the hotel's connection to the city's underground world was not just historical, it was alive, and it was dangerous. The truth about Lemoyne's disappearance seemed to be tied to forces far greater than anything I could have imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the mystery remained unsolved. Though I never uncovered all the details, I learned that in Paris, nothing is ever truly as it seems. People vanish, lives are reinvented, and the city itself holds secrets that, if revealed, could change everything. As for Lemoyne, his fate remained a mystery, his disappearance a puzzle that no one could quite piece together. And yet, as I stood at the window of the Hotel St. Clair on the final night of my stay, I could not help but feel that the mystery was not over. Paris was a city of stories, of intrigue and hidden lives, and I, like many before me, was merely a part of the puzzle, trying to make sense of the countless pieces that had yet to fall into place. Story 9, March 2025. It was a month I would never forget, one that would forever be etched in my memory, a moment when the highway, usually a mere stretch of asphalt, a connector between distant places, became a place of terror, a reminder of how fragile our lives can be in the face of human emotion. I had always thought of Australia's roads as calm, open, and liberating, a country of endless horizons, where the roads seem to stretch forever, and the sound of the tires against the pavement is the closest thing to tranquility. But in March, I learned that even the most serene paths can hide storms. It all began on a seemingly regular Tuesday morning, the sky overcast, casting a gray veil over the sprawling roads of Queensland. I was driving down the highway, heading towards Brisbane for a business meeting that had been set weeks in advance. The early morning traffic was light, which allowed me to slip into the steady rhythm of driving. As a regular on these highways, I had become used to the unpredictable nature of fellow drivers, the ones who cut you off, tailgate, or just drift in and out of lanes with little regard for safety. But that day, something felt different. A storm was brewing, but it wasn't in the clouds above. It started as a small annoyance. The silver sedan ahead of me was driving well below the speed limit. Normally, I wouldn't care too much. I'd just wait for an opportunity to pass. But there was something about the way this car swerved between lanes, almost as though the driver was deliberately trying to hold me back. I could feel my patience thinning. I wasn't in a hurry, but this kind of behavior, the erratic driving, the casual disregard for other motorists, it always got to me. I tried to overtake the sedan when the lanes widened. As I began my maneuver, I noticed the driver's sudden, aggressive swerving to the right, blocking my way. It was a blatant move, one that spoke volumes of a lack of consideration for others. I had to quickly swerve to avoid a collision, my heart skipping a beat as the sedan's side mirror nearly brushed against my fender. I instinctively honked my horn. What happened next was immediate. The silver sedan, instead of pulling back, accelerated, seemingly in retaliation, trying to box me in. I could see the driver in my rear-view mirror now, their face a mask of frustration and anger, a grimace that seemed to scream for conflict. It was as though the entire moment had shifted from mere annoyance to something darker, as if a switch had been flipped. I couldn't understand it. Was this all over something so trivial? The traffic around us began to slow as we entered a more congested part of the highway, but the tension between us remained palpable. The sedan was now in the lane next to me, and every time I tried to shift lanes, it would cut me off. My pulse quickened. I should have let it go, I knew that. I should have taken the exit, pulled over, or simply slowed down. But in that moment, something about the challenge, the unpredictability, took hold of me. I pushed my foot harder on the accelerator. The two of us were locked in this silent battle of wills, a high-speed chess game that neither of us seemed willing to lose. As we entered a series of tight curves on the highway, the encounter reached its peak. I was trying to make my way through the winding roads, but the sedan was always just there, blocking me, refusing to let me go. Then it happened. One of the sharp curves was approaching, and the sedan swerved too suddenly, cutting too close to my lane. I didn't have enough time to react. The tires screeched as both vehicles brushed against each other. A sickening sense of dread filled my chest. I fought to keep control of my car as we slid briefly before I managed to pull away. The sedan, however, didn't stop. It accelerated, now clearly in pursuit. My mind raced, the panic building. Why was this person chasing me? What had I done to provoke such an aggressive response? In a flash, I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a minor traffic incident anymore. It had escalated. There was no turning back. I tried to shake the sedan off, weaving between cars, hoping to lose them in the slower-moving traffic. But every time I thought I had gained some distance, the silver car would appear again, like a shadow, following me closely, relentlessly. It was as if they were feeding off the adrenaline, pushing forward with a dangerous intensity that was impossible to ignore. The moments stretched on, each more harrowing than the last. I could feel the anger rising within me, but also the growing fear. What if this person was truly unhinged? What if they weren't going to stop until something happened? My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Then, without warning, the sedan veered sharply to the right, cutting off another car that had been traveling parallel to us. The other driver honked furiously, but it was no use. The sedan's driver seemed to care for nothing but the immediate satisfaction of asserting dominance on the road. It was as if they were testing me, daring me to engage, baiting me into a fight. As we approached a junction, I made a split-second decision. I turned off the highway, heading down a more isolated road that led towards a quieter industrial area. I was hoping the driver would lose interest, that the encounter would finally end. But no, the sedan followed. I realized then that this wasn't just road rage. It was something darker, more obsessive. I could feel the heat of their gaze, the pressing danger of having someone this focused on you, this angry. It was like they had forgotten the world around them and only saw me as a target. There was nothing I could do except keep driving, hoping that somehow this would come to an end. Then, just as I was preparing to pull into a side street and hopefully escape, the sedan's headlights suddenly flashed in my rearview mirror. In that brief moment, I thought about how strange it all was. All this over something so small, a moment of tension on the highway. But in that flash of light, I realized that we were no longer just two drivers caught in a misunderstanding. This was something else now. The sedan rammed into my rear bumper. The impact was forceful, jarring. I swerved and fought to regain control. But in a split second, I lost it. The car veered off the road, and I could feel the wheels losing traction, sliding helplessly towards the ditch. The world spun as the car hit the ground with a sickening thud. Everything went quiet. My mind was racing, but my body was still frozen in shock. The sedan had disappeared, its driver now presumably gone. My hands were trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. I was shaken, but alive. But what of the other driver? What had led them to this? The answer came the next day, in the news. The police had found the sedan abandoned near the scene of the crash. The driver was a man in his 40s, a former truck driver with a history of road rage incidents. It seemed that the incident had spiraled beyond anyone's control, leading to a tragic end. His actions had not only ruined his life, but nearly taken mine as well. The investigation revealed that, on that day, the man's anger had consumed him entirely. He had become so obsessed with the idea of dominance on the road that he had lost sight of everything else, including his own safety. I couldn't help but think about the fragility of it all, how one decision, one moment of reckless anger, could change everything. That highway, once just a path for me to travel, had become a place of reflection, a painful reminder of how the most innocent of encounters can turn deadly when driven by unchecked rage. As I look back on that day, I'm left with more questions than answers. What if I had stayed calm? What if I had just let the man go? Would I have found myself in the same position? Or had we both been doomed from the start? Two strangers caught in a twisted game of fate? The highway had become more than a road that day. It was a battleground, a reminder of the dangers we sometimes face when our emotions drive us to places we never intended to go. The world didn't stop for me, and it won't for anyone else. That's the harsh truth of it all. It's a chilling reminder of how a fleeting moment can forever alter the course of our lives. And so, as I drive now, I keep that memory close, a cautious reminder of how much we need to control our own emotions before they take control of us. Story 10. In March of 2025, the world of live game streaming was at the height of its popularity. The industry had become a juggernaut, with millions of fans tuning in daily to watch their favorite streamers interact with them, and sometimes even influence the outcome of the games being played. It was a realm of virtual excitement and competition, where anonymity provided an illusion of safety. But as I would soon learn, sometimes the lines between the digital world and reality blur in ways that can never be undone. I was a relatively small streamer in the vast sea of online personalities, someone with a dedicated but modest fan base. I didn't have millions of followers, nor was I sponsored by major brands, but I had a niche audience that kept me going. Streaming had always been my escape from the mundane routine of everyday life. It was where I could be myself, without the pressure of expectations or the need to conform. I spent hours each day gaming, often with friends or occasionally solo, sharing my journey with viewers who enjoyed watching me fail, succeed, or even make jokes at my own expense. My streams weren't spectacular in terms of production value. I didn't have the top-tier equipment or flashy graphics that some of the more popular streamers used, but I had something they couldn't replicate: authenticity. People appreciated the genuine connection I made with them, the sense that they weren't just watching a performer, but were participating in something real, something unfiltered. That March, however, something was different. A new player had appeared in my chat. They were a regular in my streams, often lurking in the background, offering cryptic comments and emojis. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, everyone has their fair share of oddballs online. But as the days went by, their presence became more pronounced. They started to make specific references to things I had never spoken about publicly. My childhood, my family, the streets I had walked down, the places I had visited. They knew it all. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to coincidence. After all, the internet was full of people who prided themselves on being detectives, piecing together bits of public information to create a narrative. But soon, the tone of their comments began to change. Instead of simple observations, they started sending threatening messages. They spoke of how they could find me, how they could get to me. I brushed it off as nothing more than online bravado. After all, online threats were, unfortunately, common. People behind the safety of their screens often felt emboldened to say things they would never dare utter in person. But this time, the threats felt different. They weren't just random insults or challenges. There was something personal about them. They hinted at a level of knowledge that was unsettling. They spoke of my daily routine, the games I played, even the specific times I streamed. I knew that I had made a mistake by revealing too much about my life. But how could I have known that something as innocent as sharing the occasional story or discussing my day would come back to haunt me? As the threats continued to escalate, I found myself growing paranoid. I couldn't concentrate on my games as I used to. Every notification, every ping, every new message in the chat felt like a potential bombshell. I began locking my doors, checking the windows, even double-checking my security cameras. It was as if the digital world had reached through the screen and pulled me into a nightmare. But I still believed it was just someone trying to get attention. I never thought it would go further than words on a screen. Then came the fateful night. I was streaming a new release, something I had been looking forward to playing for weeks. My followers had been asking me for hours to play it, and I had finally caved, setting up my stream late in the evening. It wasn't unusual for me to stream at night. I had always preferred the quiet solitude of the late hours when the world outside seemed to slow down. But that night, as I logged in, there was an unfamiliar feeling in the air. The chat was unusually quiet at first, and then the messages started flooding in. This time, they were different, darker. Instead of cryptic references, they were filled with warnings. They were explicit, each one more direct than the last, telling me to stop streaming, to shut down the broadcast, or else. Well, I didn't want to imagine what the else meant. My heart raced as I scanned through the messages, trying to process them. I told myself that this was just another game, another attempt by someone to get attention. But then came the notification, the one that would change everything. It was a live stream alert from a viewer who had never been on my channel before. They were watching me, and they had a message to deliver. It wasn't a text message or a comment. It was a video. I hesitated, but curiosity and a strange sense of dread compelled me to click on the link. What I saw on the screen was nothing short of horrifying. It wasn't a flashy, edited video or a well-designed meme. It was a live feed of my front door. I froze. My blood ran cold as I stared at the image. It was real. Someone was outside. I scrambled to check my security cameras, but there was nothing. No one was in sight. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting for something. I turned off the stream, my fingers trembling as I clicked the buttons. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. The sense of dread that had been building up for weeks reached its peak. The threats weren't just idle words anymore. Someone was out there, someone who had crossed the line, between the digital and the physical world. The next few hours were a blur. I couldn't I contacted the authorities, of course, but they couldn't offer me any immediate help. They told me it was likely a prank or a hoax, just another case of someone trying to cause panic online. But I knew better. I had seen it firsthand, the evidence that this person was real, and they were capable of following through on their threats. I decided to take matters into my own hands, fortifying my house, setting up extra cameras, and making sure I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the image of that video from my mind, the still shot of my door, framed in the dim light of my porch, as though it was waiting for something to happen. That night, I didn't stream. I couldn't. The fear had consumed me, and I wasn't ready to face whatever awaited me. I stayed up, alert and anxious, checking every sound that came from outside. But nothing happened. The days that followed were filled with constant vigilance. I tried to go back to streaming, but the joy I once found in it had vanished. Every notification, every new follower, every comment felt like a potential threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. My once carefree gaming sessions had turned into a daily routine of fear and paranoia. In the weeks that followed, I learned that I wasn't alone. Other streamers began to speak out about similar experiences, revealing that they too had received threats, had felt the same unease. Some had even been targeted in person. It was as if the entire gaming community had awakened to a new reality, one where online threats weren't just words, they were actions, capable of reaching across the digital divide and into our real lives. The authorities eventually apprehended the individual responsible for the threats. They were caught after a lengthy investigation, which revealed that they had been using various online platforms to stalk not only me, but also several other streamers. Their motive was unclear, but the damage they had caused was undeniable. In the aftermath, I learned a valuable lesson, that the virtual world we inhabit is not as separate from reality as we might think. It's easy to forget that the people we interact with online are real, and the dangers that lurk in the digital shadows are all too real. I had learned that sometimes threats in the online world can become something much darker, something that can reach beyond the screen and into our lives in ways we never thought possible. As I moved forward, I became more cautious, more aware of the risks of sharing too much of myself online. My streams never fully returned to the carefree days they once were, but I found a new sense of purpose in sharing my story, in raising awareness about the dangers that can arise from the very platform that had once brought me so much joy. The world of gaming had always been a place of escape for me, but in that March of 2025, I realized that sometimes, even in the most innocent of games, the stakes can be higher than we ever imagined. Story 11. March 2025 was a month that would be remembered as a turning point in Brazil's political landscape. The nation, known for its vibrant culture, football prowess, and lush Amazonian forests, would soon find itself embroiled in a scandal that shook the very foundation of its democratic institutions. The news hit with the force of a thunderstorm, and like lightning, it illuminated the dark recesses of power, revealing just how deep the rot of corruption had penetrated Brazil's political system. As a journalist, I was no stranger to the murky waters of politics. I had covered numerous stories, some of them high profile, but none that felt as personal as this one. The corruption scandal, which had been brewing for months, exploded into the open in March when investigative journalists, who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, uncovered a massive fraud scheme involving politicians from all parties. It was a web so intricate, so vast, that it was almost impossible to grasp at first. But the more I delved into it, the more I realized how much of it had touched the lives of everyday Brazilians. At the heart of the scandal were allegations that several high-ranking political figures had diverted state funds meant for public services into their personal accounts. These funds, which were earmarked for infrastructure projects, healthcare, and education, had instead been funneled into the pockets of the corrupt. What was even more damning was the revelation that these transactions had been hidden through a series of offshore accounts and shell companies. The scale of the operation was staggering, and as the news spread, it became clear that this was not just a few isolated individuals, but a coordinated effort involving some of the country's most powerful figures. As I began to investigate the story further, I found myself drawn into a labyrinth of deceit and betrayal. It was as if I had stumbled upon a vast, shadowy underworld where deals were made behind closed doors, where influence was bought and sold like commodities on the stock market. The politicians involved were not just isolated figures. They were part of a larger, systematic culture of corruption that had been woven into the fabric of the Brazilian political system for decades. For them, power wasn't just a tool to serve the people. It was an opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of those they were meant to represent. The more I uncovered, the more my disbelief grew. How could such a blatant theft of public resources go on for so long without anyone noticing? The answers were as complex as the scandal itself. In Brazil, like in many other countries, political loyalty often outweighed the moral responsibility to serve the people. Political parties were not just alliances based on ideology. They were networks of power and patronage, where favors were exchanged for loyalty, and loyalty was rewarded with wealth. This created an environment where corruption could thrive, shielded by the very systems that were supposed to prevent it. But as the scandal deepened, so did the public's outrage. Protests erupted across Brazil, from the streets of Rio de Janeiro to the heart of Brasilia. People were tired of being betrayed by the very individuals they had elected to serve them. The public was no longer willing to accept the status quo. They demanded accountability, transparency, and reform. It was a call that could not be ignored. In the weeks that followed, the investigation intensified. The federal police raided the homes and offices of several prominent politicians, uncovering evidence of illicit transactions and hidden assets. Journalists and whistleblowers played a crucial role in exposing the truth, often at great personal risk. The pressure mounted on the politicians involved, and one by one, they began to fall. Some resigned, while others were arrested or faced charges. Yet even as they faced the consequences of their actions, the question remained: how deep did the corruption run? And would anyone at the highest levels be held accountable? For me, the journey was both thrilling and disheartening. As a journalist, I was driven by a desire to uncover the truth, to expose those who sought to undermine the democratic process for their own gain. But as I spent more time on the story, I began to realize that the fight against corruption was not just about exposing the guilty. It was about changing a culture that had allowed corruption to thrive for so long. The road ahead was uncertain. The Brazilian people had spoken, but would their voices be heard? Would the system that had allowed corruption to flourish for so long be dismantled? Or would it continue to perpetuate itself? With only the names of the players changing, only time would tell. But in the midst of the uncertainty, there was a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, the people of Brazil were speaking out. They were demanding change, demanding that their leaders be held accountable for their actions. It was a movement that transcended political parties, that united Brazilians from all walks of life in a shared desire for a better future. The scandal was not just about the politicians who had stolen from the people. It was about the system that had allowed them to do so. And if there was one thing I knew for certain, it was that this scandal had the potential to be a turning point. The Brazilian people were no longer willing to accept the status quo. They wanted a government that worked for them, not for the powerful elites. And if they had to fight for it, they would. As I penned the final words of my report, I couldn't help but reflect on how this story had changed me. It had started as just another assignment, another investigation into the murky world of politics. But it had grown into something more. It was a story of betrayal, yes, but it was also a story of hope. A hope that Brazil could break free from the chains of corruption and build a future that was just, fair, and truly democratic. I had been part of a movement, albeit in a small way, that sought to shine a light on the darkness of political corruption. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I hoped that this scandal would be the spark that ignited the flames of change. The people of Brazil had shown that they were no longer willing to accept the corruption that had plagued their country for so long. It was time for a new chapter in Brazil's history, a chapter where justice and integrity prevailed, and where the voices of the people could be heard above the noise of the powerful few. The story was far from over, but the wheels of change were already in motion. And I, along with countless others, was determined to see it through to the end.